Some mornings arrive disguised as ordinary days, until they steal everything you thought you knew about forever. Vanessa Ellison stood in her kitchen, steam rising from 2 ceramic mugs as the coffee maker finished its familiar morning ritual. At 32, she carried herself with a quiet grace that made strangers pause in grocery store aisles, not because of her delicate beauty, but because of something deeper, a peacefulness that seemed to flow from her very core. Her dark skin caught the early sunlight streaming through their apartment window, and her eyes held the kind of warmth that made even the most guarded people want to share their secrets. "Coffee's ready," she called softly toward the bedroom, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who knew how to make a house feel like home. Asher Vale emerged from their shared bedroom, his tall frame moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never known real urgency. At 39, he possessed the kind of understated elegance that money couldn't buy. It lived in the way he rolled up his sleeves, the careful attention he paid when Vanessa spoke, the genuine smile that reached his piercing blue eyes. His dark hair was perfectly tousled in that effortless way that only came naturally, never forced. "You spoil me," he murmured, accepting the mug with both hands, his fingers briefly brushing hers in a gesture so familiar they'd forgotten to notice it anymore. Their apartment was a study in comfortable contradictions. Expensive furniture mixed with thrift store finds, classical music playing softly, while morning news flickered silently on the television. Asher's inherited wealth had never translated into ostentation. Instead, it had given them the luxury of choosing simplicity. Books lined every available wall, photography equipment sat carefully organized in the corner where Vanessa worked, and everything felt lived in rather than displayed. "Did you sleep okay?" Vanessa asked, settling beside him at their small dining table. She'd been asking this question more often lately, something about the way he'd been breathing at night, subtle changes that only someone who'd shared a bed for 6 years would notice. "Like a baby," he lied gently, not wanting her to worry about the strange pressure he'd been feeling in his chest, the occasional moments when his heart seemed to skip like a scratched record. "Your turn to pick the weekend movie tonight." She laughed, that musical sound that had first made him fall in love with her in a crowded downtown cafe all those years ago. "You always say that, then somehow we end up watching your documentaries anyway." "That's because you have excellent taste," he countered, taking a long sip of coffee. "And because you secretly love learning about ancient civilizations." They sat in comfortable silence, the morning light growing stronger as the city awakened around them. Vanessa scrolled through her phone, checking the weather for an outdoor photo shoot she had planned later that day. Asher read snippets from the news, occasionally sharing something interesting, their voices creating the kind of domestic symphony that only comes from years of choosing each other, day after ordinary day. "I love this," Vanessa said suddenly, looking up from her phone. "What?" "This. Right now. Coffee with you on a Tuesday morning. I know it sounds silly, but it doesn't sound silly," Asher interrupted gently, reaching across to touch her hand. "I love it too." If they had known it would be their last normal morning, would they have held on to it longer? Would they have paid more attention to the weight of Asher's hand in hers, the way his laugh sounded when she teased him about his serious expression while reading? The simple miracle of being chosen by someone who saw all your flaws and decided to stay anyway. But ordinary moments don't announce themselves as last times. They slip by disguised as routine until memory transforms them into treasures. Asher finished his coffee and stood to rinse his mug in the sink, a small gesture of consideration that Vanessa had always appreciated. He moved with his usual calm efficiency, but as he turned from the sink, something shifted. The color drained from his face like water from a broken glass. "Asher?" Vanessa's voice carried a note of concern she didn't yet understand. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, only a strangled breath emerged. His eyes went wide with confusion and fear, as his left hand instinctively clutched his chest. The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor in sharp, irreversible pieces. "Baby, what's wrong?" Vanessa was on her feet instantly, her body moving before her mind could fully process what was happening. Asher tried to take a step toward her, but his legs betrayed him. He crumpled to the floor like a marionette with severed strings, his body seizing in ways that made no sense, his breath coming in gasps that sounded like drowning on dry land. "No, no, no," Vanessa whispered, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch, afraid not to. "Asher, stay with me. Look at me, baby. Look at me." His beautiful blue eyes found hers for just a moment, confused, scared, but still somehow trying to reassure her even as his own world collapsed. Then they rolled back, and he was gone. Even though his body remained, even though his heart was still fighting a battle it was destined to lose. Vanessa's hands shook as she dialed 911, her voice barely recognizable as she gave their address, as she followed the dispatcher's calm instructions, as she performed CPR on the man who had just been laughing with her about ancient civilizations and weekend movies. The ambulance arrived in what felt like hours but had been only minutes. Paramedics flooded their peaceful kitchen, transforming their intimate morning space into a scene of controlled chaos. They worked with professional efficiency, their voices clipped and clinical as they discussed medications and vital signs and transport protocols. "Ma'am, we need to take him now," one of them said gently, and Vanessa realized she'd been holding Ash's hand, unwilling to let go, as if her touch alone could anchor him to consciousness. She followed the ambulance in her car, still wearing her pajamas, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The hospital corridors blurred past in a nightmare of fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smells, and the terrible, hollow sound of her own footsteps echoing off linoleum floors. Hours passed. Doctors emerged with serious faces and careful words. Massive cardiac arrest, they explained. Significant oxygen deprivation to the brain. They used phrases like uncertain prognosis and wait and see, and prepare yourself for all possibilities. But the possibility they didn't prepare her for was the one that became reality. Asher Vale, the man who had chosen coffee with her on Tuesday mornings, who had filled their home with classical music and gentle laughter, who had looked at her that very morning with eyes full of love and plans for the future, slipped into a coma so deep that medical science could only shrug and call it a mystery. As evening fell and the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, Vanessa sat beside his bed in the ICU, watching machines breathe for him, watching monitors trace the rhythm of a heart that had forgotten how to support the consciousness of the man she loved. She took his hand in both of hers, and for the first time since the coffee mug had shattered on their kitchen floor, she spoke to him. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." She had no idea that somewhere in the darkness behind his closed eyes, Asher heard every word, and that this promise would become the foundation of a love story that would redefine everything she thought she knew about forever. What would you do if the person you loved most could only hear your voice in their darkness? How far would you go to keep them tethered to this world? 3 weeks had passed since the morning that shattered everything, and Vanessa had learned that hospitals have their own cruel rhythm. The ICU hummed with constant activity. Nurses checking monitors every hour, doctors making rounds with clipboards and serious expressions, the soft beeping of machines that had become the soundtrack to her new reality. She had memorized every sound, the whoosh of the ventilator that breathed for Asher, the steady pulse of the heart monitor, the gentle whir of the IV pump delivering medications whose names she was slowly learning to pronounce. "Mrs. Vale," Dr. Harrison approached her with the same careful expression he'd worn for weeks. "How are you holding up?" Vanessa looked up from the book she'd been reading aloud to Asher, The Old Man and the Sea, his favorite, and managed a tired smile. "I'm fine. Any changes?" Dr. Harrison glanced at Asher's still form, his face revealing nothing. "His vitals remain stable. The brain activity shows some fluctuation, which isn't uncommon, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Vanessa, you know I have to ask. Have you given any thought to the long-term care facility we discussed?" The question hit her like ice water. She'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it was coming. "He belongs here, with the best equipment, the best care. The cost is substantial," Dr. Harrison said gently. "Even with insurance coverage, the specialized monitoring, the experimental treatments we're trying, it adds up quickly. The facility I mentioned has excellent care, and it would be significantly more affordable." Vanessa's hand instinctively tightened around Asher's. Money isn't the issue. But even as she said it, she thought about the banking app on her phone, the numbers that seemed to shrink each time she checked them. Asher's savings had been substantial, old family money that he'd never touched much, preferring to live simply. But substantial had a different meaning when it was being measured against round-the-clock intensive care, experimental medications, and the kind of hope that came with a price tag. "I understand," Dr. Harrison said, though his expression suggested he'd had this conversation with other families before. "Just think about it, for both your sakes." After he left, Vanessa pulled her chair closer to Asher's bed. His face was peaceful, almost serene, with the ventilator tube taped carefully to hold it in place. His dark hair had grown longer, softening the sharp lines of his cheekbones. Someone had shaved him that morning, probably Marcus, the male nurse who always took extra care with the small details. "He thinks I should move you," she whispered, stroking his hand, "to a place that costs less. But you can't hear classical music in those places, baby. You can't have someone read to you whenever you want. You can't have me." In the silence that followed, she could have sworn she felt his fingers tighten slightly around hers. But the monitors showed no change, and the doctors had warned her about seeing signs that weren't really there. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Lindsay. "Nessa, you missed dinner again. When was the last time you went home?" Home. The word felt foreign now. Home was wherever Asher was, even if Asher was trapped somewhere she couldn't follow. She typed back, "I'm fine. Tell Mom I'll call her tonight." But she wouldn't call. She couldn't handle another conversation about letting go or moving forward or what Asher would want. None of them understood that what Asher would want was for her to fight. He would want her to believe in impossible things, the way he'd always believed in her photography, when she was just another struggling artist with more dreams than talent. "Remember when I wanted to quit?" she said aloud, settling back into the vinyl chair that had become her second home. "I'd gotten rejected by every gallery in the city, and I came home crying. You made me that terrible grilled cheese, burned on one side, raw on the other, and you told me that quitting wasn't allowed in our house." She smiled at the memory, even as tears pricked her eyes. "You said my photos captured something most people couldn't see. The space between moments, you called it. I thought you were just being sweet, but now I think I know what you meant." Pulling her camera from her bag, she looked through the photos she'd taken over the past few weeks. Not of Asher, but of the life that continued around his stillness. The way afternoon light slanted through the hospital window, creating patterns on the floor. The gentle curve of a nurse's hands as she adjusted his pillows. The shadow his profile cast against the white wall. The space between moments. The life that existed in pauses, in waiting, in the terrible, beautiful act of loving someone who couldn't love you back. "Mrs. Vale," a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Carmen, one of the evening nurses, a young woman with kind eyes and gentle hands. "I wanted to let you know I'll be taking care of Asher tonight. Is there anything special he likes? Music or—" "He loves Chopin," Vanessa said immediately. "Nocturnes especially, and he likes it when someone talks to him. About anything, really. Books, the weather, what's happening in the world." Carmen nodded, making notes. "I'll remember that. You know, I've been a nurse for 8 years, and I've seen a lot of families go through this. But the way you love him, it's something special." "He'd do the same for me," Vanessa replied simply. After Carmen left, Vanessa returned to her book, reading aloud in the dim evening light. Outside the window, she could see the city settling into night, lights coming on in office buildings, traffic streaming past on the distant highway, people heading home to families who would answer when they spoke. He was an old man who fished alone in a skiff in the Gulf Stream, and he had gone 84 days now without taking a fish, she read, her voice steady and warm. What she didn't know was that in the vast darkness where Asher existed, her voice was the only light. Every word she spoke painted colors in his black world. Every story she told became his reality, and every night when she finally went home to their empty apartment, he fought to follow her voice back to the surface of consciousness, inch by impossible inch. 3 weeks. That's how long it had been since he'd heard her say, "I love you," with her actual voice, instead of just in his dreams. But he was beginning to understand that time moved differently in this place, between sleeping and waking, and he was beginning to believe that love might be the only navigation system strong enough to find his way home. 2 months into their new reality, Vanessa discovered that grief wasn't a destination. It was a daily commute. She stood in line at the hospital cafeteria, clutching a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, listening to 2 residents discuss a patient's prognosis in hushed, clinical tones. Their words blended into the background noise of her life now, beeping monitors, shuffling footsteps, the distant sound of someone crying behind a closed door. "The usual?" asked Beth, the cafeteria worker, who had become unexpectedly familiar over the weeks. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of no-nonsense kindness that came from years of feeding people in crisis. "Please," Vanessa managed, though she wasn't really hungry. Eating had become mechanical, something her body required, but her heart couldn't quite remember how to want. Beth handed her a turkey sandwich and an apple, the same lunch she'd been buying every day for weeks. "How's your husband today?" The same, Vanessa replied, because it was easier than explaining that the same had become both her greatest fear and her only comfort. No worse meant he was still fighting. No better meant she was still waiting. Her phone buzzed as she walked back toward the ICU. A text from her mother. "Sweetheart, your dad and I are worried. You can't live at that hospital forever." But her mother was wrong. She could live here forever. She'd already proven that. She'd mastered the art of sleeping in vinyl chairs, of showering in hospital bathrooms, of making conversation with night shift nurses who'd become the closest thing to roommates she had anymore. Back in Asher's room, she found Carmen adjusting his position to prevent bed sores, one of the many small rituals that had become part of caring for someone whose body had forgotten how to care for itself. "Any visitors today?" Carmen asked gently. Vanessa shook her head. Asher's family had stopped coming after the first month. His brother Wesley had been blunt about it. "Nessa, this is killing you. He's gone. The man in that bed isn't Asher anymore." But Wesley was wrong too. This was exactly Asher, the part of him that never gave up, that fought battles no one else could see, the part that had fallen in love with her imperfections and stayed in love with them even when she couldn't see them herself. "I brought something today," she said, settling into her chair and pulling out her laptop. "Remember how you always said I should try video editing? Well, I finally learned." She opened a folder containing months of photos she'd taken around the hospital, not of patients or staff, but of light. The way morning sun created geometric patterns on the floor, how shadow and reflection played across the windows during golden hour, the small moments of beauty that existed even in places designed for healing and hoping and holding on. "I made a slideshow," she explained, tilting the screen toward his bed, even though his eyes remained closed. "I thought you might like to see what I've been capturing while I wait for you to wake up." The photos began to cycle through, each one accompanied by soft piano music. Chopin, of course. Vanessa watched her own work with new eyes, seeing patterns she hadn't noticed while taking them. Each image seemed to capture something essential about this place, the tension between despair and hope, the way love could exist in the smallest gestures, the beauty that persisted even when everything else fell apart. "You were right about the space between moments," she whispered. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what you meant." In the depths of his coma, Asher felt every pixel of those images burning into his consciousness. He recognized Vanessa's artistic eye, the way she found poetry in the mundane, but more than that, he felt her presence in each photograph, her persistence, her refusal to let beauty die just because the world had become darker. He tried to move, to give her some sign that he was receiving every gift she offered, but his body remained stubbornly disconnected from his will, a prison that seemed designed to torture both of them with its perfect stillness. "Mrs. Vale?" "Doctor." Harrison appeared in the doorway, his expression more serious than usual. "Could I speak with you privately?" Vanessa's stomach clenched. Private conversations with doctors never brought good news. She followed him into the hallway, leaving her laptop playing the slideshow for Asher, the soft piano filling the room with something that sounded like hope set to music. "I've been reviewing Asher's latest brain scans," Dr. Harrison began, his voice carefully neutral. "There's been some changes." "What kind of changes?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "The swelling that we've been monitoring has decreased significantly. His brain activity patterns are showing more organization, more awareness, if you will. It's subtle, but it's there." Vanessa felt her knees weaken. "What does that mean?" "It means we might want to consider reducing some of the sedation medications. Let his brain work a little harder, see if he responds. But I have to warn you, this could go either way. He might begin to wake up, or we might discover that the damage is more extensive than we hoped." "Do it," she said immediately. "Vanessa, you should understand that even if he wakes up, he might not be the same person you remember. Brain injuries like this can change everything. Personality, memory, cognitive function. You need to prepare yourself for the possibility that—" "He's still in there," she interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I know he is. I can feel it." Dr. Harrison studied her face for a long moment. "We'll start tomorrow morning, gradually reduce the medications and see how he responds. But you should know, if there's no improvement after 2 weeks, the hospital board is going to require us to discuss alternative care arrangements. I'm sorry, but the costs—" "I understand," Vanessa said, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. She returned to Asher's room to find the slideshow still playing, now cycling through images of their apartment, photos she'd taken during her brief visits home to collect clothes and check mail, pictures of his coffee cup still sitting in the sink where she'd left it that morning. his book lying open on the nightstand, the impression his head had left on his pillow. "Did you hear that, baby?" she whispered, taking his hand. "Tomorrow, they're going to try to wake you up. I need you to fight, okay? I need you to come back to me." Deep in his darkness, Asher heard her plea with perfect clarity, and for the first time in 2 months, he felt something shift, like a door opening in a house that had been locked for too long, letting in the first breath of air that smelled like possibility. Tomorrow would change everything. He could feel it approaching like dawn after the longest night of his life. He just had to remember how to reach for the light. The morning they reduced Asher's sedation, Vanessa arrived at the hospital before sunrise. She found Carmen finishing her night shift, making final notes in Asher's chart. The room felt different somehow, charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. The monitors showed the same steady rhythms they'd displayed for months, but something in the air had shifted, like the moment before a storm, when even the birds go quiet. "How was his night?" Vanessa asked, settling into her familiar chair. "Restless," Carmen replied thoughtfully. "More movement than usual. His REM cycles were more active." She paused, studying Asher's face. "I've seen patients come back from places like this before. It's not magic, it's work, hard work, and it takes time." After Carmen left, Vanessa opened her laptop and continued working on a photo editing project she'd started the week before. A client's wedding that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. The bride's joy seemed impossibly bright, almost offensive in its simplicity. Two people promising forever to each other, believing that love could survive anything because they'd never been tested by the weight of anything. "I used to be that naive," she murmured to Asher, adjusting the exposure on a photo of the couple's first dance. "Remember our wedding? How certain we were that we'd figured out some secret formula for happiness." She glanced at his left hand, where his wedding ring caught the morning light. She'd been wearing both their rings since the accident, his on a chain around her neck, hers still on her finger where it belonged. The weight of both reminded her daily that some promises were meant to be kept, even when keeping them felt impossible. Dr. Harrison entered with a small team of residents, their footsteps measured and professional. "Good morning, Vanessa. We're ready to begin." She watched as they adjusted medication drips, reducing the chemical fog that had kept Asher's brain in artificial twilight for over 2 months. The changes were subtle, numbers on screens, adjustments to IV lines, but they felt monumental. "How long before we know if it's working?" she asked. "Could be hours, could be days," Dr. Harrison replied. "Every brain responds differently. We'll monitor him closely and watch for any signs of increased consciousness." Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Vanessa found herself scrutinizing every twitch, every breath, every flutter of his eyelids, for signs that he was fighting his way back to the surface. She'd read to him from 3 different books, played his favorite playlist twice, and shown him photos from their last vacation together, a quiet weekend in the mountains, where they'd hiked in comfortable silence and made love under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Around noon, her phone rang. Lindsay's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, Nessa, how's he doing today? They reduced his sedation this morning. We're waiting to see if he responds." A pause. That's good news, right?" "Maybe, I don't know. Everything feels like maybe right now." "I've been thinking," Lindsay said carefully. "Maybe I should come stay with you for a while, just until you know more about his condition. You shouldn't be going through this alone." The offer was generous, born from love and concern, but Vanessa found herself hesitating. She'd grown protective of the space she'd created here, the rhythm of her days with Asher, the conversations she had with him that no one else would understand, the way she'd learned to find comfort in his silent presence. "I'm not alone," she said finally. "He's here with me." "Nessa." Lindsay's voice carried the gentle exasperation of someone who'd been watching a loved one drift away. "You know what I mean." Before Vanessa could respond, she heard it, a sound so soft she almost missed it. A breath that seemed different, deeper, followed by what might have been a sigh. "Lindsay, I have to go," she whispered, ending the call and moving closer to Asher's bed. His face remained peaceful, but something had changed. The quality of his stillness seemed less absolute, as if he was floating closer to consciousness. She took his hand, studying his features for any sign of awareness. "Asher? Baby, can you hear me?" In the vast darkness where he existed, Asher felt her voice like a rope thrown into deep water. The chemical fog that had been holding him under was lifting slowly, layer by layer, and with each breath he could feel himself rising towards something that might be light. But consciousness wasn't returning like a switch being flipped. It was more like dawn breaking gradually over a landscape he'd forgotten how to navigate. Fragments of sensation began filtering through. The warmth of Vanessa's hand in his, the soft beeping of monitors, the faint smell of hospital antiseptic mixed with her familiar perfume. "I'm here," he heard her say, and those two words became an anchor in the confusion of slowly awakening senses. "I've been here the whole time, waiting for you to come back to me." He tried to respond, to move, to give her some sign that he was receiving her love like radio signals across an impossible distance. His fingers seemed to belong to someone else, but he concentrated all his will into the simple act of movement. Vanessa felt it. The slightest pressure from his hand, so subtle she might have imagined it if she hadn't been hoping for it so desperately. "Did you just squeeze my hand?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nothing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, another gentle pressure. She pressed the call button for the nurse with shaking fingers, never taking her eyes off Asher's face. When Marcus arrived, she could barely speak around the hope that was threatening to choke her. "He squeezed my hand," she managed. "Twice. I think he's trying to respond." Marcus checked the monitors, then gently took Asher's other hand. "Asher, if you can hear me, can you squeeze my hand?" The seconds stretched like hours. Then, with what seemed like enormous effort, Asher's fingers moved against Marcus's palm. "Well, I'll be damned," Marcus breathed, a grin spreading across his face. "He's in there. He's definitely in there." In the darkness behind his eyelids, Asher felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the possibility of return. Vanessa's voice had been his compass through the void, and now he was beginning to remember the way home. But the journey back to consciousness would prove to be just the beginning of learning how to live again. The first time Asher opened his eyes, Vanessa was asleep. It happened on a Thursday evening, 3 days after the hand squeezes that had sent ripples of hope through the entire ICU staff. Carmen was checking his vitals when his eyelids fluttered, then slowly, deliberately, opened. The blue eyes that stared back at her weren't quite focused, but they were undeniably aware. "Oh my God," Carmen whispered, her hand flying to the call button. "Asher, can you hear me?" He blinked once, a movement so intentional it might as well have been a conversation. The sound of running footsteps and urgent voices woke Vanessa from the fitful sleep she'd been managing in increasingly short intervals. She jerked upright in her chair to find Dr. Harrison leaning over Asher's bed, a small flashlight in his hand. "Follow the light, Doctor," Harrison was saying, moving the beam slowly from left to right. Asher's eyes tracked the movement with effort that seemed to exhaust him, but he followed it. When his gaze found Vanessa's face, something shifted in his expression. A recognition so profound it made her breath catch. "Hi, baby," she whispered, moving to his bedside. "Welcome back." He tried to speak, but the ventilator tube made that impossible. Frustration flickered across his features, and Vanessa could see him struggling against the constraints of his own body. "It's okay," she said, taking his hand. "You don't have to talk right now. You're safe. You're here. That's enough." Over the next 48 hours, Asher's awakening unfolded in slow motion. The ventilator tube was removed, leaving his voice hoarse and weak from months of disuse. His first word was her name, spoken so quietly she had to lean close to hear it. "Vanessa." It sounded like a prayer, like relief, like coming home after being lost in a foreign country where no one spoke your language. "I'm here," she replied, the same words she'd been saying for months, but now they had an answer. "I heard you," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every day. Every word." The implications of that statement would take time to fully understand, but for now Vanessa simply held his hand and cried tears that tasted like gratitude and relief and the strange sweetness of promises kept. Recovery, they discovered, was nothing like the movies made it seem. Asher's body had to relearn basic functions that most people took for granted. Swallowing required conscious effort and often ended in frustrated coughing fits. His muscles had atrophied during months of stillness, leaving him unable to sit up without assistance. Simple tasks like holding a cup or writing his name demanded concentration that left him exhausted. But the hardest part wasn't physical. It was navigating the gap between the man he remembered being and the man he was becoming. "I feel like I'm watching my life through someone else's eyes," he told Vanessa one afternoon, as she helped him practice basic motor skills with a physical therapist named Diane. "What do you mean?" Vanessa asked, though she thought she understood. The man lying in the hospital bed looked like Asher, sounded like Asher, but moved through the world with a carefulness that spoke of someone who'd learned not to take consciousness for granted. Everything feels fragile, he said, struggling to grip a foam ball that should have been effortless to squeeze. Like if I move too fast or think too hard, I might slip back into that darkness. Diane, a woman in her 40s with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd guided hundreds of patients through similar journeys, paused in her instructions. That feeling is normal, Asher. Your brain is working hard to rebuild connections that were damaged. It's going to take time. How much time? He asked. Diane exchanged a look with Vanessa. That depends on you, and on how hard you're willing to work. The work was grueling. Hours of physical therapy to rebuild muscle strength. Speech therapy to address the slight slur that remained from neurological damage. Occupational therapy to relearn tasks like buttoning shirts and typing on a keyboard. Asher approached each session with the same quiet determination that had once driven him to master complex business strategies, but Vanessa could see the toll it took. Some days were better than others. On good days, he could walk the length of the hospital hallway with minimal assistance, could feed himself breakfast without spilling, could hold conversations that lasted more than a few minutes without fatigue overwhelming him. On bad days, his body refused to cooperate despite his will, and frustration would build, until he retreated into silence that reminded Vanessa too much of the months when silence was all they had. I used to be able to do calculus in my head, he said one evening after a particularly difficult session where he'd struggled to remember the names of common objects. Now I can't remember what I had for lunch. You had chicken soup, Vanessa said gently. And you finished the whole bowl, which is more than you managed yesterday. That's not the point, isn't it? She set down the book she'd been reading and turned to face him fully. Asher, 3 months ago, you couldn't breathe on your own. Now you're frustrated because your recovery isn't happening fast enough. That's not failure, that's being alive. He was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the city lights that had become a familiar constellation during their extended stay in this sterile sanctuary. I heard everything you said to me, he said finally. Every story you read, every song you played, every time you told me about your day. It was like listening to life from underwater. I could hear it, but I couldn't quite reach it. What was it like? Being in the coma? Asher considered the question carefully. Like being trapped in a room with no doors, but being able to hear people talking in the next room. I knew you were there, knew you were waiting, but I couldn't figure out how to get to you. Your voice was the only thing that felt real. Vanessa felt her throat tighten. I wasn't sure if talking to you mattered. The doctors said there was no way to know if you could hear anything. It was everything, he said simply. It was the thread I followed back to the surface. That night, as Vanessa settled into the cot the hospital had finally provided, after months of her sleeping in chairs, she listened to the sound of Asher's breathing, unassisted, steady, his own. It was a sound she'd never taken for granted before the accident, but now it seemed like the most beautiful music she'd ever heard. Vanessa, his voice came soft through the darkness. Yeah, thank you, for staying, for believing I'd come back when everyone else thought you should let go. She reached across the space between them and found his hand. You would have done the same for me. I love you, he whispered. I love you too. But even as they spoke those familiar words, both of them understood that they were different people now than they'd been on that last normal morning over coffee. The question that neither was ready to ask was whether the love they'd shared could evolve to embrace the people they were becoming. Outside the hospital window, the city continued its restless motion, but inside their small room, two people who'd found their way back to each other were learning that sometimes the hardest part of any journey is figuring out what comes next. 6 weeks after Asher first opened his eyes, Dr. Harrison delivered the news they'd been both hoping for and dreading. We're ready to discuss discharge planning, he announced during his morning rounds, clipboard in hand and that careful expression that meant important decisions lay ahead. Asher's made remarkable progress. His motor functions are improving daily. His cognitive assessments are showing steady gains, and medically, he's stable enough for outpatient care. Vanessa felt her stomach flip, going home. The phrase should have filled her with joy, but instead it triggered an anxiety she couldn't quite name. The hospital had become their world, controlled, predictable, staffed with people who understood the delicate balance of recovery. Home felt like foreign territory now. What does that mean exactly? Asher asked, his voice stronger than it had been weeks ago, but still carrying the careful cadence of someone who had to think about forming words. Physical therapy 3 times a week, speech therapy twice a week, regular follow-up appointments with neurology, Dr. Harrison explained, and patience, lots of patience. Recovery from this type of brain injury can take months, sometimes years, but you can continue that process at home, which is usually better for long-term healing. After the doctor left, Asher and Vanessa sat in silence, both processing what going home would actually mean. Their apartment, frozen in time since that terrible morning, waited for them like a museum of their former lives. "Are you ready for this?" Vanessa asked, though she wasn't sure if she was asking him or herself. "I don't know," Asher admitted. "Everything here feels safe, controlled, out there." He gestured vaguely toward the window. "I don't know what I am out there anymore." The discharge process took 3 days to arrange. Insurance approvals, equipment rentals, medication protocols, emergency procedures, the logistics of rebuilding a life outside institutional care. Vanessa found herself taking notes constantly, overwhelmed by the responsibility of becoming Asher's primary caregiver while still trying to be his wife. Their first challenge came before they even left the hospital parking garage. "I can't," Asher said quietly, staring at the passenger seat of their car as if it might swallow him whole. "I can't get in." Vanessa understood immediately. The last time he'd been in this car, he'd been unconscious on a stretcher. Before that, it had been the morning of his cardiac arrest, a lifetime ago when they were different people living in a simpler world. "We can take a taxi," she offered. "No." His jaw set with determination she recognized from the old Asher, the man who never backed down from challenges. "I need to do this." It took 20 minutes and several false starts, but eventually he managed to settle into the passenger seat, his hands gripping the door handle and her hand with equal intensity. The drive home was silent, except for his carefully controlled breathing and the familiar sounds of their neighborhood coming back into focus. Their apartment felt impossibly small after months in hospital rooms designed for medical equipment and multiple visitors. But more than that, it felt haunted by the ghosts of who they used to be. The coffee mug he'd dropped still sat on the kitchen counter. Vanessa had never been able to bring herself to clean it up. His book lay open on the nightstand, to a page he'd never finished reading. Their bed was still unmade from that last normal morning, sheets tangled exactly as they'd left them. "It's like a crime scene," Asher said softly, standing in the doorway of their bedroom. "I know. I didn't know how to change anything without you here." They spent that first day moving carefully around each other and their shared history. Asher tired quickly. Just walking from room to room exhausted him in ways that left him frustrated and discouraged. Vanessa found herself hovering, wanting to help but not knowing how much assistance was helpful versus insulting. "I used to be able to carry you to bed," he said that evening, staring at the stairs leading to their bedroom with the expression of someone facing Mount Everest. "And now I get to carry you," Vanessa replied, though they both knew that wasn't quite how it worked. Recovery wasn't about role reversal. It was about learning entirely new ways to exist together. The second night home, Asher had his first panic attack. It started with irregular breathing during dinner, take-out Chinese food that tasted nothing like either of them remembered, then sweating, despite the comfortable temperature, then the terrible, hollow look in his eyes that meant he was slipping back toward that dark place where she couldn't follow. "I can't breathe," he gasped, one hand clutching his chest in unconscious echo of that terrible morning months ago. "I can't. What if it happens again? What if I go back there?" Vanessa guided him to the couch, her own heart racing as she tried to remember the breathing exercises they'd learned in therapy. "Look at me, baby. You're here. You're awake. You're breathing on your own. But what if? No what ifs. Right now, this moment, feel my hand in yours. Hear my voice. You're not going anywhere." It took 45 minutes for his breathing to return to normal, and another hour before he stopped shaking. When it was over, they both understood that coming home meant confronting fears that the safety of the hospital had allowed them to postpone. "I'm scared," he admitted, his head in her lap as she stroked his hair. "I'm scared that I'm broken in ways we haven't discovered yet. I'm scared that you'll get tired of taking care of someone who might never be the man you married." Vanessa was quiet for a long time, processing his words and her own complicated feelings. The truth was, she was scared too. Scared that the weight of being both wife and caregiver would crush the romantic love they'd shared. Scared that the man she'd fallen in love with might never fully return. Scared that her own dreams and ambitions had become casualties of this extended crisis. "I'm scared too," she said finally. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe being scared means we're being honest about how hard this is going to be. Do you think we can make it? Through all of this?" She looked down at his face, thinner now, marked by months of struggle, but still unmistakably his. "I think we can learn to make it, day by day, morning by morning." That night, They slept in their own bed for the first time in 6 months. Asher's breathing was uneven with anxiety, and Vanessa lay awake listening to every sound, alert for signs of distress. But sometime before dawn, exhaustion overtook fear, and they both fell into deep sleep. When morning came, Asher woke first and lay quietly watching Vanessa sleep. In the early light filtering through their bedroom window, she looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with years ago. Peaceful, beautiful, unguarded. But he could see the changes too. New lines around her eyes, a tension in her shoulders, even in sleep, the weight of months spent holding vigil. He realized then that recovery wasn't just about him learning to be himself again. It was about both of them learning to be together in a world that had fundamentally changed while they weren't paying attention. The question was whether the love that had sustained them through the worst of times could evolve to sustain them through the uncertain work of building something new. 3 months into their new life at home, Vanessa discovered that love could feel like the most beautiful burden in the world. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning when she found herself standing in the shower, fully dressed, with the water running cold over her clothes while she cried for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. Asher was sleeping. He still needed 12 hours of rest to function through a basic day, and the silence of their apartment had become both sanctuary and prison. She'd been awake since 4 a.m., checking his breathing every 20 minutes out of habit and anxiety that refused to fade. When she finally got up to start coffee, she'd realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd taken a photograph that wasn't related to documenting Asher's recovery. Couldn't remember the last conversation she'd had with another adult that didn't revolve around medication schedules or therapy appointments. "Nessa," Asher's voice came through the bathroom door, concerned but groggy. "Are you okay in there?" She turned off the water and wrapped herself in a towel, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin. "I'm fine, baby, just give me a minute." But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. When she emerged from the bathroom, Asher was sitting on the edge of their bed, his hair standing up in directions that would have been endearing if everything else wasn't so complicated. His motor skills had improved dramatically, but mornings were still his most vulnerable time, the period when his brain needed extra time to fully engage with his body. "You were crying," he said simply. It wasn't a question. Vanessa considered lying, considered protecting him from her own struggles the way she'd been doing for months, but something about the genuine concern in his eyes, so much more present than they'd been even weeks ago, made her choose honesty instead. "I love you," she said. "But I'm drowning, Asher, and I don't know how to say that without making you feel guilty for something that isn't your fault." He was quiet for a long time, processing her words with the deliberate care that had become his way of navigating complex emotional territory. "Tell me what drowning feels like." So she did. She told him about the photography clients she'd had to turn away because she couldn't commit to shooting weddings when she never knew if he might have a bad day. About the friends who'd stopped calling because every conversation became an update on his condition. About the dreams she'd been having where she was running through hospital corridors that never ended, looking for something she'd lost but couldn't name. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she admitted, "like I've become so focused on helping you remember who you are that I've forgotten who I am." Asher listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. When she finished, he reached for her hand with movements that were still slightly uncertain but determined. "I've been selfish," he said quietly. "No, you haven't. You've been recovering from a traumatic brain injury. That's not selfish. That's survival. But I've also been hiding," he continued, "using my recovery as an excuse to avoid thinking about what this has cost you, what it's still costing you." They sat in silence, hands linked while the morning light grew stronger outside their bedroom window. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of their neighborhood coming to life, people walking dogs, cars starting, the normal rhythms of lives that had continued moving forward, while theirs had been frozen in crisis mode. "What do you need?" Asher asked finally. The question was so simple, so direct, that it caught Vanessa off guard. In all the months of medical appointments and therapy sessions and careful monitoring of his progress, no one had asked her what she needed. "I need to take pictures again," she said immediately. "Real pictures, not just documentation. I need to remember what it feels like to see beauty instead of just watching for signs of improvement." "Okay, what else?" I need to know that we can talk about hard things without me worrying that stress will make you worse. I need to know that I can have a bad day without feeling guilty about it. And I need to know that I can get better without feeling like I'm racing against your patience running out," Asher added quietly. It was the first completely honest conversation they'd had since he'd woken up, and it felt both terrifying and liberating. That afternoon, while Asher napped, Vanessa drove to a park across town, somewhere with no medical associations or recovery-related memories. She brought her camera and spent 2 hours photographing strangers, an elderly man feeding ducks, teenagers skateboarding with fearless joy, a mother teaching her toddler to climb playground equipment. Through her lens, she rediscovered the thing that had first drawn her to photography, the ability to capture moments of genuine human connection, the space between breaths where real life happened. She felt like she was remembering a language she'd almost forgotten how to speak. When she returned home, she found Asher in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a look of intense concentration as he chopped vegetables for what appeared to be an attempt at dinner. His movements were careful but confident, and for the first time in months he looked like someone cooking because he wanted to, not because it was physical therapy. "How was your day?" he asked, the question carrying weight beyond its simple words. "Better," she said honestly. "How was yours?" "I called Dr. Harrison," he said, continuing to chop with methodical precision. "Asked him about support groups for couples dealing with brain injury recovery. Turns out there's one that meets Thursday nights at the hospital." Vanessa felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "You want to go to group therapy?" "I want us to learn how to do this better," he said, looking up from the cutting board to meet her eyes. "I want to learn how to get better without taking you down with me." That evening, they ate the slightly overcooked stir-fry Asher had prepared and looked through the photos Vanessa had taken that afternoon. For the first time since his accident, their conversation wasn't dominated by medical updates or therapy schedules. Instead, they talked about the teenager's fearless joy, the patience in the mother's voice, the peaceful contentment on the old man's face as he fed the ducks. "You're still amazing at this," Asher said, studying a particularly striking shot of light filtering through trees. "I'd forgotten how you see things that other people miss." "I'd forgotten too," Vanessa admitted. "Maybe we can help each other remember," he said, "who we were before this happened, who we might become because of it." As they cleaned up together, Asher washing dishes with careful concentration while Vanessa dried, both of them felt something shifting. Not the dramatic transformation of movie recoveries, but the quieter, more sustainable change that comes from choosing to build something new rather than trying to recreate something lost. Outside their kitchen window, the city continued its restless motion, but inside their small apartment, two people who loved each other were learning that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that love alone isn't enough. You also need the courage to change, to grow, and to forgive each other for being human in the face of impossible circumstances. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in months, they were walking it together instead of one carrying the other. The phone call that would change everything came on a Friday afternoon while Asher was at physical therapy. Vanessa was editing photos in their living room, a new routine that had emerged from their honest conversation weeks earlier, when her phone rang with a New York number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. "Is this Vanessa Ellison?" The voice was professional, confident, with the kind of Manhattan polish that made even simple questions sound important. "Yes, this is she. My name is Rebecca Sterling. I'm the curator at the Morrison Gallery in Chelsea. I've been looking at your photography portfolio online, and I'd like to discuss a potential exhibition opportunity." Vanessa's hand went still on her laptop keyboard. The Morrison Gallery wasn't just any gallery. It was the kind of place that launched careers, that turned photographers from dreamers into names people recognized. "I'm sorry, I think there might be some mistake," Vanessa said slowly. "I haven't submitted anything to your gallery. Actually, your work was brought to my attention by one of our board members who saw some pieces you'd posted on social media. The series you've been working on, the hospital photographs, the intimate moments of waiting and healing, it's exactly the kind of emotionally resonant work we're looking for." Vanessa felt the world tilt slightly. The photos Rebecca was talking about were the ones she'd taken during Asher's recovery, images she'd shared sporadically on Instagram without thinking about them as a cohesive body of work. Hands holding across hospital beds, light streaming through medical equipment, the poetry she'd found in the most sterile environments. "We'd like to offer you a solo exhibition," Rebecca continued. 3 months from now, if you're interested. I know it's short notice, but we've had a cancellation and your work would be perfect for the space." After Rebecca hung up, Vanessa sat in stunned silence, staring at her phone as if it might offer some explanation for how her life had just pivoted toward possibility. A solo exhibition in New York, the dream she'd carried for years, offered to her now when she'd almost forgotten to dream at all. When Asher returned from therapy, sweaty and exhausted but moving with more confidence than he'd shown in months, she was still sitting in the same spot. "Good session?" she asked, though her voice sounded strange even to herself. "The best yet," he said, settling beside her on the couch with the careful movements that had become automatic. "I walked on the treadmill for 20 minutes straight. No support rail." He paused, studying her face. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." So she told him about the phone call, about Rebecca Sterling and the Morrison Gallery, and the opportunity that felt too good to be real. She watched his expression change as she spoke, surprise giving way to excitement, then to something more complicated. "Vanessa, that's incredible," he said, and she could hear that he meant it. "The Morrison Gallery. Do you know what this could mean for your career?" "I know, but what?" She struggled to articulate the conflict that was tearing her apart. "It's in New York. The exhibition would require me to be there for at least 2 weeks. Meetings with buyers, press interviews, networking events, and I can't travel yet," Asher finished quietly. "It's not just that, it's everything. The timing, the distance, the fact that these photos exist because of the worst period of our lives. It feels wrong somehow, like I'd be profiting from our trauma." Asher was quiet for a long time, his fingers drumming against his knee in a rhythm that used to annoy her, but now felt comforting in its familiarity. "Can I see them? The photos she's talking about?" Vanessa opened her laptop and pulled up the Instagram posts from the past year. Together, they scrolled through images she'd almost forgotten taking. Her own hands wrapped around a coffee cup in the hospital cafeteria, the geometric patterns of afternoon light on waiting room floors, the silhouette of a nurse adjusting equipment in the soft glow of monitors. "These are beautiful," Asher said softly. "I had no idea you were seeing all of this while you were taking care of me." "I wasn't really seeing it at the time. It was just survival. Finding something beautiful to focus on when everything else felt impossible. But that's exactly what makes them powerful," he said, studying a particularly striking image of 2 shadows cast by hospital chairs. "You weren't trying to document trauma. You were documenting hope, persistence, the way love looks when it's tested." They spent the evening talking through the practical implications. The exhibition would be scheduled for late spring, giving them more time to establish routines that could support Asher's continued recovery. His physical therapist had mentioned the possibility of transitioning to a less intensive schedule soon, and Dr. Harrison had been increasingly optimistic about his cognitive progress. "What scares you most about it?" Asher asked as they got ready for bed. Vanessa considered the question honestly. "Leaving you, not being here if something goes wrong, but also succeeding. Having something that's mine that exists separate from taking care of you, is that selfish?" "It's human," Asher said, "and it's overdue." The next morning, Asher surprised her by asking to come along on her weekly photography walk, something she'd been doing alone since their conversation about her needs. His stamina was still limited, but he managed to walk with her through their neighborhood for an hour, watching as she worked. "But you move differently when you're taking pictures," he observed, as she crouched to capture the way morning light hit a fire hydrant. "More like yourself." "What do you mean?" "At home, with me, you're always thinking about something else. My medications, my therapy schedule, whether I'm having a good day or bad day. But when you're behind that camera, you're completely present. You're just Vanessa." That afternoon, she called Rebecca Sterling back. "I'd like to accept your offer," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "But I need to be completely transparent about my situation." She explained about Asher's condition, about the limitations and uncertainties that would shape how she approached the exhibition. Rebecca listened without interrupting, then surprised her with her response. "Vanessa, authenticity is exactly what makes art matter. The fact that these images come from real experience, real love, real struggle, that's not a liability. That's what will make people connect with them." 2 weeks later, Vanessa was in their kitchen printing exhibition materials when Asher appeared with a cup of coffee and a shy smile. "I have something for you," he said, handing her an envelope. Inside was a plane ticket to New York, dated for the week of her exhibition. "Asher, we can't afford—" "I called my brother Wesley," he interrupted. "Asked him to help me arrange some care coverage for the days you'll be gone, and I used some of the money from my disability insurance to buy the ticket." He paused, meeting her eyes. "I want to be there when you succeed. But the travel, the stress, your routine, "We'll survive a few days of disruption," he said firmly. "This is your moment, Vanessa. Our moment. I heard you talking to me for months when I couldn't respond. Now, I want to be there when the world hears what you have to say." As she held the ticket, Vanessa felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year, the possibility that their story might have more than one happy ending. That recovery didn't just mean returning to who they used to be, but discovering who they could become. Outside their kitchen window, spring was beginning to announce itself in small ways. Buds on trees, longer days, the promise that winter eventually gives way to something warmer. Inside their small apartment, two people who had learned to love each other through the worst of circumstances were preparing to discover what love looked like when it was given room to grow. The Morrison Gallery opening was nothing like Vanessa had imagined during all those years of dreaming about this moment. She stood in the center of the pristine white space, surrounded by her own images blown up to museum scale, and felt like she was viewing her life through someone else's eyes. The photographs that had documented her most private moments of grief and hope now hung under carefully positioned spotlights, each one accompanied by a small placard with her name printed in elegant font. "The artist captures the sacred in the sterile," a critic was saying to a small group of collectors near the entrance. "These images transform medical spaces into cathedrals of human endurance." Vanessa felt Asher's hand find hers in the crowded room. He'd made the trip despite Dr. Harrison's concerns about travel fatigue, and though she could see the exhaustion around his eyes, he stood beside her with quiet pride that made her chest tight with gratitude. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured, studying a large print of light streaming through hospital blinds, a photo she'd taken on one of his worst days when depression had settled over him like fog. "Seeing our hardest moments turned into art. Do you mind that these exist, that people are looking at them?" Asher considered the question seriously, the way he approached everything now, with deliberate thought and careful honesty. "I mind that we went through it, but I don't mind that something beautiful came from it." Rebecca Sterling appeared at Vanessa's elbow, her enthusiasm barely contained, as she gestured toward a cluster of serious-looking people examining the largest piece in the exhibition, a triptych titled "The Space Between Breaths," that showed the same hospital room at 3 different times of day. "The response has been extraordinary," Rebecca said quietly. "We've already had multiple purchase inquiries, and there's talk of the piece being considered for the Whitney Biennial. Vanessa, this could change everything for you. Change everything." The phrase that had terrified her months ago now felt full of possibility rather than threat. But as she looked around the gallery, at strangers moved to tears by images of her lowest moments, at critics finding meaning in photographs she'd taken simply to survive, she realized that everything had already changed. This exhibition was just the world catching up to a transformation that had been happening in increments for over a year. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," Rebecca continued, guiding them toward a woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes who was studying a photograph of Vanessa's hands holding Asher's in the ICU. "This is Margaret Whitman from the Times Art section." The interview that followed felt surreal. Margaret asked thoughtful questions about artistic process and inspiration, but what she really wanted to know about was love, how it looked under pressure, how it survived when everything familiar was stripped away, how two people learned to be together when one of them had temporarily disappeared. "Your husband was in a coma for several months," Margaret said, her voice gentle but direct. "Was it difficult to find beauty during that period?" Vanessa glanced at Asher, who nodded encouragingly. "I wasn't looking for beauty," she said honestly. "I was looking for hope, but sometimes they're the same thing. And now that he's recovered, how has your relationship changed?" It was Asher who answered. "We're different people than we were before," he said, his words slow and measured but confident. "The accident took away some things, my mobility, my cognitive speed, our sense of security, but it also revealed things we didn't know we had, depths of love we'd never had to access." As the evening progressed, Vanessa found herself in conversations she'd never imagined having. Art collectors asked about purchasing pieces that documented the most vulnerable moments of their lives. A documentary filmmaker wanted to discuss a project about love and recovery. A gallery in Los Angeles expressed interest in hosting the exhibition next, but the moment that would stay with her forever came near the end of the evening, when a young woman approached them hesitantly. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but I wanted to thank you." She was perhaps 25, with kind eyes and the careful posture of someone carrying invisible weight. My partner had a stroke 6 months ago. He's still in rehabilitation, and some days I feel like I'm drowning. But seeing these photographs, reading about your story, it helps me remember that love doesn't always look like what we expected it to look like. Vanessa felt tears prick her eyes. What's his name? David. He's 28. We were supposed to get married next month. The woman's voice caught. People keep telling me I'm young, that I shouldn't tie myself to someone whose future is uncertain. But seeing how you two made it through, it's not about making it through, Asher said gently. That's about choosing each other every day, even when the choice looks different than it did before. The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you, both of you, for showing what it looks like to stay. After she walked away, Vanessa and Asher stood quietly among the photographs that told their story to strangers. The gallery was beginning to empty, the opening night excitement winding down, but neither of them seemed ready to leave. Do you remember what you said to me that morning? Asher asked, studying the image that had started it all. A simple photograph of morning light on a hospital floor that she'd taken while waiting for him to wake up. Which morning? The first one, when you promised you weren't going anywhere. I remember. I held on to that promise for months. It was the thread I followed back to consciousness. But tonight, watching you in your element, seeing people respond to your work, he paused, searching for the right words. I realized that staying doesn't mean stopping. You kept your promise, but you also kept growing. You became more yourself, not less. As they walked through the quiet gallery one final time before leaving, Vanessa saw their story reflected in the carefully curated sequence of images. It wasn't a story about tragedy or even recovery. It was a story about transformation, about two people who had learned that love wasn't just about promising to stay the same, but about having the courage to change together. Ready to go home? She asked, though home felt different now, not just the place they returned to, but the space they created together wherever they were. More than ready, Asher replied, his hand firm and steady in hers. But as they walked toward the gallery exit, past images that would soon travel to other cities and touch other lives, both of them understood that they weren't just going home to their apartment. They were going home to a life they had built from the broken pieces of their former selves, a life that was messier and more complicated than what they'd started with, but also more honest, more intentional, and more beautiful for having been tested by fire. The gallery lights dimmed behind them as they stepped into the New York night, but the warmth between them burned steady and bright, a flame that had learned to survive in any weather. 2 years after the morning that changed everything, Vanessa woke to find Asher sitting on the edge of their bed, fully dressed, staring at his hands with an expression she hadn't seen since his darkest days in the hospital. "Baby," she said softly, instantly alert. "What's wrong?" He looked up, and she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach clench. Not the confusion of his early recovery days, but a clarity that somehow seemed worse. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "Something I should have said a long time ago, but I was too scared, too selfish." Vanessa sat up, her heart beginning to race with the kind of fear that came from knowing that some conversations changed everything, regardless of how much you loved the person speaking. "The morning I had the cardiac arrest," Asher began, his voice steady but strained. "It wasn't completely random. I'd been having symptoms for weeks. Chest pain, irregular heartbeat, shortness of breath. I'd been hiding it from you." The words hit her like ice water. "What do you mean, hiding it?" "I made an appointment with a cardiologist 3 days before it happened. He told me I needed immediate surgery, that my arteries were severely blocked, that I was at risk of a massive heart attack. He wanted to schedule me for emergency bypass surgery that same week." Vanessa felt the room tilt around her. "And you didn't tell me?" I swear I was going to tell you that morning over coffee. But you were so happy talking about your photography project and His voice broke slightly. "I didn't want to ruin everything. I thought maybe I could handle it on my own. Maybe find a less invasive treatment. Maybe you could die and leave me wondering what I did wrong." The words came out sharper than she intended, but the pain behind them was real and raw. "Asher, do you understand what this means? You could have prevented this. The coma, the months of hell, I know." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know what I cost us, what I cost you." They sat in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of this revelation settling between them like a third presence in their bedroom. Outside, the city was waking up to another ordinary Tuesday, but inside their apartment, 2 years of carefully rebuilt trust were crumbling in real time. Why are you telling me this now? Vanessa asked finally. Because yesterday, when we were at Dr. Harrison's office, and he was talking about how well I've recovered, how lucky we are that I survived. Asher's hands clenched into fists. I realize that our entire story, everything we've built, is based on a lie. You think you fell in love with someone who fought bravely against an unavoidable tragedy, but the truth is, you fell in love with someone who was too much of a coward to face his problems, who nearly destroyed both our lives because he couldn't have one difficult conversation. Vanessa felt tears burning her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of fury so pure it surprised her. You're right, she said, her voice shaking. I did fall in love with that person, the person I thought you were, the person who shared everything with me, who trusted me with his fears, who didn't make unilateral decisions about our life together. Vanessa. No, she stood up, pacing to the window because sitting still felt impossible. Do you understand what the last 2 years have been like for me? The guilt I've carried, wondering if I missed signs, if I could have prevented it. The nights I've lain awake thinking that maybe I wasn't paying enough attention to you. Maybe I was too focused on my own problems to notice that you were struggling. I never wanted you to blame yourself, but you let me. The words exploded out of her, months of suppressed doubt and self-recrimination finally finding their target. For 2 years you let me think I had failed you somehow. You let me carry that weight while you played the role of the grateful recovering patient. Asher stood slowly, his movements careful in the way that had become habitual, but also, she realized now, strategic. You're right to be angry. You're right to hate me. I don't hate you, Vanessa said, and the admission felt like another kind of betrayal. That's what makes this so much worse. I love you. I've loved you through hell and back literally, but I don't know if I can love someone who doesn't trust me enough to share the truth. They faced each other across their bedroom, the same room where they'd learned to sleep together again, where they'd navigated panic attacks and nightmares, where they'd slowly rebuilt intimacy after months of medical focus. Now it felt like a courtroom, where the verdict would determine whether their marriage could survive another fundamental reshaping. I was scared, Asher said finally, his voice breaking completely. I was scared that if I told you about the heart problems, you'd see me differently. As fragile, as damaged, as someone you had to take care of instead of someone you chose to be with. And then when the surgery could have prevented everything, I was scared you'd think I was weak for not going through with it immediately. So instead you made the choice for both of us, Vanessa said quietly. You decided that protecting your pride was more important than protecting our partnership. Yes, the admission came out like a physical pain, and I've regretted it every day since I woke up and saw what it cost you, what it cost us. Vanessa moved to the dresser where their wedding photo sat, the two of them young and certain and completely unprepared for the ways life could test the promises they were making. She picked it up, studying their faces, trying to reconcile those hopeful people with who they'd become. I need time, she said without turning around. I need time to process this, to figure out what it means for us. How much time? I don't know. She set the photo down carefully as if it might shatter. Maybe I need to go stay with Lindsay for a while. Maybe we need some space to figure out who we are when we're not in crisis mode. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet they'd learned to share. This was the silence of two people standing at a crossroads, unsure which direction led toward healing and which led toward goodbye. The person you fell in love with, Asher said finally. He wasn't brave. He was just better at hiding his fears. The man I am now, the one who can tell you this truth even though it might destroy us, maybe he's actually braver. Maybe he's the person you deserve. Vanessa turned to look at him, this man who had died and come back to life, who had relearned how to walk and talk and love, who was now asking her to forgive him for the lie that had made their entire journey necessary. Maybe, she said, but I need to figure out if I can love him. As she packed a bag with hands that shook only slightly, Vanessa understood that this was their real test, not the coma, not the recovery, not the months of rebuilding their life together. This moment, where truth had finally been spoken, and they had to decide whether honesty was worth the destruction it brought, this was where they would discover what their love was actually made of. The morning light streaming through their bedroom window looked exactly like it had 2 years ago, before their world had shattered the first time, but the people standing in that light were different now, scarred, wiser, and finally, brutally honest with each other. Whether that honesty would save them or break them remained to be seen. 6 months later, the coffee shop where they'd agreed to meet was nothing like the place where they'd first fallen in love all those years ago. This one was deliberately neutral, a small cafe near the hospital where they'd spent so much time, chosen because it belonged to neither of their separate lives, but somehow still felt like theirs. Vanessa arrived first, ordering the same latte she'd been drinking for weeks during her lunch breaks from the photography studio where she now worked part-time. The job had been Rebecca Sterling's suggestion, a way to stay connected to her art while building something stable and independent, something that was hers alone. She'd been living with Lindsay for 3 months, sleeping in her sister's guest room, and slowly remembering what it felt like to make decisions without considering someone else's medical needs or emotional state. It had been healing in ways she hadn't expected, but also hollow in ways that surprised her. When Asher walked through the cafe door, her breath caught. He looked different, not just healthier, but more solid somehow. His movements were confident in a way that spoke of someone who'd stopped being afraid of his own body. He'd been living alone in their apartment, learning to navigate independence that he'd never had to claim during his recovery. "Hi," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the careful smile of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. "Hi, yourself." She studied his face, noting the changes that 6 months of separation had brought. "You look good, really good." "So do you." He paused, then added with the honesty that had cost them everything and might yet save them, "You look like yourself again." They ordered coffee and sat in the awkward silence of 2 people who'd shared everything, trying to figure out how to make small talk. Finally, Vanessa spoke. "How's the support group going?" Asher had started attending meetings for people dealing with chronic illness and the psychological aftermath of medical trauma. It had been Dr. Harrison's suggestion, but Asher had embraced it with the thoroughness he brought to everything now. "Hard," he said honestly, "but good. I've been learning a lot about why I made the choices I made, about the difference between protecting someone and lying to them." "And what have you learned?" "That I was lying to myself most of all. I told myself I was protecting you, but really I was protecting my image of myself as someone who had everything under control." He stirred his coffee unnecessarily. "I've been seeing a therapist too, individual sessions, working on why I thought my fear was more important than your right to know the truth." Vanessa nodded. She'd been in therapy too, trying to understand why she'd lost herself so completely in taking care of someone else, why she'd found it easier to be a caregiver than a partner with her own needs and dreams. "I got the offer from the Los Angeles Gallery," she said. "They want to expand the exhibition into a permanent installation. It would mean relocating for at least a year." Something flickered across Asher's face. Not the fear she'd expected, but something that looked almost like relief. "That's incredible, Nessa. It's everything you've worked for." "I haven't said yes yet." "Why not?" The question hung between them, loaded with all the conversations they'd avoided during their months apart. Vanessa took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Because I wanted to have this conversation first. Because I needed to know whether we're trying to fix something broken or whether we're learning to let go of something that doesn't work anymore." Asher was quiet for a long time, watching people pass by the cafe window, couples holding hands, families managing strollers and shopping bags, individuals moving through their lives with the confidence of people who trusted their own choices. "I love you," he said finally. "I will always love you. But I think maybe the question isn't whether we can go back to what we had. Maybe it's whether we can build something new that's honest from the beginning." "What would that look like?" "I don't know. Maybe it looks like you taking the Los Angeles opportunity because it's what you want, not because you're running away from me. Maybe it looks like me learning to be whole on my own before I ask you to be whole with me." Vanessa felt tears prick her eyes. Not the angry tears of 6 months ago, but something softer and more complicated. "Are you saying goodbye?" "I'm saying that maybe love isn't about holding on no matter what. Maybe it's about loving someone enough to let them choose you freely, even if they might choose something else." They talked for 2 hours, covering ground they'd been afraid to walk during the crisis years when survival felt more important than honesty. They talked about the ways they'd both changed, about dreams they'd set aside and fears they'd never admitted. They talked about the difference between the love that holds you together and the love that helps you grow. When they finally stood to leave, they embraced in the cafe doorway, not the desperate clinging of people afraid to let go, but the gentle holding of people who trusted each other enough to choose separation if that's what love required. "Will you write to me?" Asher asked. "From Los Angeles?" "If you want me to. I want you to." 1 year later, the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, forwarded from Vanessa's old address to her new apartment in Venice Beach. Asher's handwriting was stronger now, more confident, but she still recognized the careful loops of someone who'd had to relearn the simple act of holding a pen. Nessa, I wanted you to know that I'm getting married. Her name is Claire, and she's a physical therapist I met in group. She knows everything about my medical history, about the choices I made, about you and about the ways I learned to love better because of what you taught me. I'm not writing to hurt you or to prove that I've moved on. I'm writing because she asked me to tell her about the person who saved my life. And when I told her about you, she said she wanted to thank you, not for letting me go, but for loving me well enough that I learned how to love someone else honestly. I hope Los Angeles is everything you dreamed it would be. I hope you're taking pictures that make strangers stop and remember what it feels like to be human. I hope you're happy in ways that are completely your own. Love, always, Asher, P.S. I kept the photo of morning light on the hospital floor. It reminds me that beauty exists even in the hardest places, and that some people have the gift of seeing it. You were always the one who could see what others missed. Vanessa sat on her apartment balcony, looking out at the Pacific Ocean and holding the letter until the sun set. Then she opened her laptop and began typing a response. Not to Asher, but to the world. She was writing about love, about the kinds that save you and the kinds that set you free, about the courage it takes to choose someone every day and the different kind of courage it takes to let them choose you back, about the space between holding on and letting go, where the most honest kinds of love learn to live. It would become her most read blog post, shared thousands of times by people trying to understand their own complicated hearts. But that night, she was just a woman writing by lamplight, grateful for the love she'd known and the love she'd learned to release, understanding finally that both were necessary for becoming the person she was meant to be. Outside her window, waves crashed against the shore in their eternal rhythm of coming and going, holding and releasing, forever faithful to the dance between arrival and departure that makes all love and all life possible. Have you ever loved someone enough to let them go? What would you risk for a love that's built on complete honesty? Your participation in this channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.